Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Maxine McKew, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this new news session where for the next hour, the questions you have posed will hold our media leaders to account. I should say, first of all, are you all enjoying the festival? I can't see you.
Yes.
You're enjoying the festival?
Yes.
Good. And the new news sessions?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay. I also want another show of hands. How many journalism students in the audience? Just to give us an idea. Where are the house lights? Oh, no one's getting me the lights now. I can't say, okay. Not many hands up, not many journalism students? Smattering, okay. How many are here because you've had it with the way the news is being presented? Right, okay. How many of you are here because you think you're sick of the way politicians talk and the way in turn the media reports that? Okay, well that takes care of most of you. Okay, got it? Right, we're going to traverse some of those things today. We're fortunate indeed to have here at Federation Square some of the top media bosses in the country. ABC Chief Mark Scott, Crikey Editor Sophie Black and Fairfax CEO Greg Hywood. Please welcome them. Now, you may not have heard of our fourth panellist, but he is destined for great things. He's a man who operates across all platforms, and boy does he know how to craft an attention-getting question. Kevin Rennie, right down the end of the panel there, has joined the panel because his question received the highest voting score. 666, I'm a bit suspicious of that. 666 of you want to see Kevin's question answered, so panel, I hope you are ready. Now, ladies and gentlemen, because you are a politically informed and media-savvy audience, you will have noticed that someone is missing. The man with the bellicose manner and the threatening voice is not here. Where's Alan? I sense some of you are asking. And you know what? It's not because we forgot to send Alan Jones an invitation. It's not because we didn't think he's quite Melbourne enough, not new news enough. We thought about it, but then reflected that he would probably be a bit tired at the end of a week of harangues outside Parliament House. But you know, we did invite the people who are responsible for 70% of news coverage in this country. We sent the invitation via email. Then we used that museum piece, the telephone. You remember the telephone? It's something that nobody under 30 uses anymore. We asked Chris Mitchell. We asked Simon Prestel. In the end, we asked for anyone from News Limited. But no, they were all washing their hair or whatever it is that News Limited people do during writers' festivals. Perhaps they didn't want to face scary Mark Scott, who has been really mean to them in recent years. Anyway, the upshot is we will just have to make do with our plucky trio and Kevin. Now, this new news event, ladies and gentlemen, has been made possible by a partnership between the Public Interest Journalism Foundation at Swinburne University in conjunction with the Melbourne Writers' Festival. And it's very much the brainchild of award-winning author and journalist Margaret Simons. So well done, Margaret. As much as anything, new news is a response to a communications world that is transforming the way we gather and consume news. New news is about the future of journalism and is designed to connect readers, listeners and viewers with the people who run the media. We all know it's a noisy, congested marketplace out there, and new news is our GPS. You can see it that way. And because New News believes in participative democracy, it's teamed up this year with Our Say. Now that's a website that allows you to post the questions that you want answered by our leaders. It is new. It was launched only this time last year at the festival and is run by 4 young social entrepreneurs who never sleep but want to change the world. Marginal seat members, watch out. They are on their way to your electorates. But where were you last year when I needed you? When my backhand was really under strain. Now, to get down to business. As I say, we'll be working through the questions posted on the Our Say site, but because I can never stick to the script, I'll be using a lot of latitude when it comes to supplementary questions. So Kevin, are you ready?
I am.
This is your moment. Fire away and give us the question that 666 people want the answer to.
Okay, mine's about quality journalism and the responsibility of our leaders to provide that. What skills will be essential for journalists in the newsroom of 2050?
Well, my view is that 2050 there won't be a lot of difference in the newsrooms of 2050 against now. Perhaps superficial tall young men will be by 2050. An average height of at least 6.5 feet in the old measure. But fundamentally, the skills will remain the same. What journalism is all about is using scepticism and filling the newsroom full of sceptical, at times difficult, at times completely impossible to manage people, and set them in the direction of finding out what is going on out there, uncovering stories, and then going back or doing it from where they stand or sit, and using the available technology to distribute that information. It's a fundamental exercise that has gone on for hundreds of years in free societies and will continue in much the same way. So I would assume that the technology will be essentially mobile because people certainly in this day and age like mobility, and I can only imagine that's a trend that will continue. But the journalism will have to hit people where they want it and how they want it. The sort of people, and this is the essential core of what quality journalism is about, is that the people that you want in that newsroom have to have one fundamental characteristic, and that is that they don't care if people don't like them. Most people in the world want to be liked. If you're a journalist, you have to, through the phone or face-to-face or be it by email, ask people questions they don't want to be asked. It's a very difficult thing to do. It's a very difficult thing to do all your life, and unless you can do it, you can't be a really good journalist.
Sophie?
I agree with Greg in that the fundamental skills of a journalist will remain the same, in that you need to ask the tough questions of people, you need to get out there and find the stories. So in that way, the newsroom will be the same, with one fundamental difference, and that is that these journalists will have to be able to invite the audience into that newsroom, and they're no longer an audience, because they're having a conversation, and they'll have it with you or they'll have it without you. And that is the fundamental difference that the internet has brought to media. It has fundamentally changed the power structures, and the skills of a great journalist, which we're only just beginning to realise, will be in tapping into the stories that are out there, in not only eavesdropping on conversations, but facilitating them and curating them, and both finding stories and drawing on the skills of your readers and your audience. And that's what the traditional media needs to be able to learn to do. That's absolutely essential in order for them to remain relevant. And I think Oursay is an absolutely perfect example of that. Essentially what Oursay is doing is facilitating a conversation. It's they are collecting a group of people, they are curating that conversation, and they are bringing it to us. And that, I think with certainty we can say that will continue to develop beyond 2050 and beyond. I think speculating on the technology is absolutely impossible, because you think about how quickly it has developed. You think about the fact that university students hardly use email. I mean, they use Facebook to communicate. They've already skipped what we see as a central form of communication. They've skipped that process entirely. So I'm hoping for jetpacks and hovercrafts in 2050. That's my hope. But essentially, great journalists will continue to ask hard questions, but they will ask questions of their audience, and they will utilise their audience.
Mark?
Well, I think it's a very hard question because we're going. People have described the era that we're in as dog years. You know, you're having 6 or 7 years experience for everyone. I think all of us would say the changes that we're going through now are just remarkable for their speed and their extensiveness. A couple of observations though. One is I think the craft skills that used to be very segmented, that you'd have a reporter who'd stand in front of a cameraman and a sound recordist and then an editor. All those skills will be complete in the one person. I think we're seeing a lot of that now. I think with the subbing changes at Fairfax, you're seeing an expectation that journalists will have more skills, broader skills, and I think you will see more video journalists, more reporters who are taking photographs, so extensive and broad skills. But also I think though, the ability to go deeply and intensively into a subject if you need to be specialised and to bring real insight into certain subject areas. Because, you know, as Sophie said, this is going to be a partnership, this is going to be a collaboration with the audience. There's going to be so much content and so much information that comes in. One of the questions will be, well, why as a professional journalist are you different? Why should we listen to you? What are you bringing that the audience itself isn't bringing? And part of it, I think, will be the quality of curation. Part of it will be the ability for you to be able to guide in partnership with an audience through all that information to a place of truth or insight, and I think that will be quite significant. The other question I think I have is, will there still be a newsroom, an actual newsroom, not a virtual newsroom? And I was punting it, I'd say there will still be benefit in people coming together and the wisdom and insight that comes from collaboration and debate and dialogue. You know, the kind of thing you get today in the conferencing process where lots of people sit around a table and argue it out. And the insight you get from that is so much more profound than someone working in isolation. And I suspect that the human impact of being in a room together will still be beneficial, even though you can do that in a virtual sense.
An obvious one, Mark. I mean, in a week that the ABC's been celebrating the life of someone like Paul Lockyer. I mean, the great thing about Lockyer was that he left the office. He left the newsroom.
Yeah.
Went out and he listened.
Absolutely.
And he reflected back quite a deep understanding.
Yeah, I think insight that it's hard to get on the phone, insight that you can't just get through reading or through email. And at Paul's memorial service yesterday in Sydney, there was a wonderful farmer who came and spoke about the insights that Paul would get by dropping in and talking and really experiencing that, and how reflected in a depth and insight in his journalism that others reporting on rural Australia couldn't get. And I know what you mean, Greg, when you say that you have to be willing to ask the tough questions. But one of the things I've been reflecting on, thinking about Paul Lockyer, is the remarkable level of goodwill that he generated with all those people he reported on, even though he was reporting often on difficult stories and on their darkest day. And I do think there's a sweet spot there somewhere, the ability to exercise journalism with courage and be able to do tough stories and ask tough questions, but to try and be able to do it in a way that when people see that story go to wherever they read it in the paper, as much as possible, they think, well, that's the truth, that's how it was, and that's fair. And, you know, I think that it's a combination of both, I think, that will still be very enduring in 2050.
Kevin, do you want to follow up on what you've heard?
Yeah, I'd agree with just about all of those. I noted down some of the words that I think are really important, like personal and professional integrity and empathy and passion, as distinct from cynicism, which seems to be the go these days. But we could get a really long list. But I think the question for media organisations is, how do they guarantee the kind of culture and environment that enables young journalists to grow, to pick up the expertise, and perhaps to do some of the things that Mark was suggesting. Resist unethical behaviour when people are pushing them that way. Speaking up within their organisation when it might be unpopular. Challenging the norms of the way that things operate. And of course, refusing just to produce crap when that's what's getting an audience.
We won't get you to define crap, we could be here
No,
all
I
day.
think
But
that's
I
been
think
well done.
you've hit on a very important point. And again, this has been a week where 4 journalists have been suspended from Channel 9 in Brisbane because they faked it. Or now, whether they were doing that on their own or whether there were people down the line or up the line indeed who were part of a whole culture that found that acceptable. Where will we be on ethics in 2050? Mark, we'll come back.
Well, I thought it was a very interesting move by Channel 9, and I think it actually almost reflects the fact that news organisations know, and I think in a sense this may be part of a reflection back of the News of the World experience, then in a world that is saturated for content, saturated for choice, why will people trust and listen and engage with you? And one is that they need to trust you. And if in fact you are trading on that trust, you're trading on your reputation, and that under pressure it fails, then in a sense, that breach of trust with the audience will have a very severe consequence. And so, in a sense, we are investing more on editorial training, editorial values, more workshops, more discussion, because we know it's going to be a very important point of distinction for media organisations in a media-saturated world.
Sophie?
Transparency is everything. You have to be able to account for your actions to your audience. You have to be able to admit mistakes. I think the first thing is to, I think your audience respects you if you do put your hand up and say, look, this went wrong, this is what we've done to address it, and this is what we're ensuring, this is what we're doing to ensure that that won't happen again. So I think accountability and transparency, and it's also interesting to see the Channel 9 experience play out. Look, I don't think what they did is necessarily new in that industry in some areas. I think it's been done before. I think if anybody's watched Frontline, I mean, it's sort of smacked of Martin D'Stasio in some parts, but I think news outlets are put under more and more pressure these days because the audience have so many different options available to them, and they're talking it over with each other. They're talking about it in the pub, they're talking about it on Facebook, they're talking about it on Twitter, and so this pressure kind of snowballs, and news agencies have to be seen to be doing something. Whereas once upon a time you might get scorched on Media Watch and you'd suffer the indignity of that, and you get a lot of letters into the station or into the newspaper. It's much more public these days. You're kind of airing your entrails, and you have to be able to do that. As icky as it is and as embarrassing as it can be, ultimately that's a good thing for the audience, I think.
Well, what do you say to young journalists?
You have to constantly have that conversation with them. You have to talk issues through. You have to talk issues through as you see them unfurl in the news. You have to talk them through internally. As Mark says, you need to have workshops. You need to be training them across all sorts of different platforms and scenarios now, because in some ways, some of this is common sense, but you are navigating your way through these problems at such a fast speed and across so many different platforms now that it's absolutely essential to offer that guidance to young journalists and to be right there to discuss these things and to talk them through it.
Great.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's ultimately trust, isn't it? I mean, what traditional media companies have done, the service they fundamentally delivered, so let's just talk about newspapers, which is the way traditional media tends to be defined these days. What they've done, and the Sydney Morning Herald, a masthead in our organisation, has been doing this for 180 years. It's the second longest continuously published newspaper in the world after the Times of London. So it's been going on for a long time, nearly as long as this country has been around with European settlement. And what it's fundamentally done is it's looked out at the world and decided, here are 100 things that we think you, our audience, would be interested in. These are the things that are shaping the world. And you do it through all the available technology, but for people to come back day after day after day, there's a required trust. And the issues of ethics only get more important when the choice is available, when the choice is broader and broader. I absolutely concede the point around the conversation, because technology enables a fundamental democratisation of information. It's been a transformation in our societies. We've seen countries fall because of transparency of information. It's the end of the Soviet Union. It was the end of communism. That wasn't about armed might. It was about the fact that totalitarianism cannot cope with transparency of information, and technology in those terms, the fax machine brought down that edifice. So what we do, ethics are absolutely crucial, but there is so much information out there that the role of the expert, the role of people who have the skills and have the ethical base to deliver the trust is critically important. Absolutely critically important. If you look at the internet, what's occurred with the internet over recent years is it's moved. There was a fabulous piece in Wired magazine last October about this called The Death of the Web. Right? The web being the search capability of the internet. And what it said was people are now wanting solutions rather than the capacity to search, because there is just so much out there. And that's what apps are about. Apps are about, here is what you want, and here is a solution via the internet to do that. So we're seeing that our technology move back to the point where there is a premium on trust. And if you are in a position where you've got a tradition of trust, it's extremely important that we maintain that and deliver that.
But Greg, how do you maintain that when, how does a journalist in a newsroom trust the source who may be an eyewitness in a street with a flip camera? Because that's where the news is coming from.
Absolutely. And this is the technology, the technology issue. This is the fact that it can be manipulated, and this is the risk of transparency. The more transparency you have, the greater the capacity for manipulation. So fundamentally what you do with your people is that you ask them, is it the right thing to do? We have strict ethical requirements, but we also have a set of fundamental rules. Is it the right thing to do? Would your mother still love you if you did this? I'm not kidding. Those sorts of questions about the human choice that you have to make.
Yeah, but hang on, just something very practical. Murder in Brunswick. Somebody phones in. I've got it. Don't you put that straight to her online? You check it out first. What happens now? You check. Right. So even if it means not being first with it.
Yeah. Oh, of course.
It's been on radio.
Of course. What you have to do is check it. That is the trust that you're delivering. Here's a piece of information. We've checked it out. We believe it to be true. We put it up.
And others will take a different model, because there will be websites that will put it up, and then if it proves to be wrong, they'll take it down.
What do you think of that?
Pardon?
What do you think of that?
Well,
because that's one set of protocols for that platform, and a very different set of rules from what Greg is describing.
Absolutely right. And I think you need to know what your organisation is, what your organisation stands for, and where it is. So if you go to a website like TMZ in the States, which is full of celebrity gossip and paparazzi shots and video taken, that's their proposition is, we're first, come to us, you never know what we're going to have here, and then lawyers will make them take things down, or things will get verified and they might remove it. That's just not what I think our media organisations stand for, and how we can operate. And so the line that says we'll get it right eventually, but we'll be first, that's not where an organisation like the ABC can stand. So we have to be willing not to be first in order to be sure to get it right. And I think sometimes you can overstate it. When Four Corners is doing a story, they are checking and verifying the facts that they are being told. And in a sense, in a user-generated content world where a lot of information is coming to you, you need to either be able to check and verify, or be able to say, we haven't been able to check and verify. We did an interesting thing during the floods in Queensland where we used Ushahidi, where we asked audience members to report into us what they could see where they were. And so on our website we said, here is the information that the police and the authorities have confirmed, here is what our reporters can verify, here is what our audience is telling us. And so again, being quite transparent and not putting, in a sense, ABC brand values.
So there were sources and there were sources.
Absolutely right, and we've been quite clear to our audience what they were, and so our audience could get as fuller information as they could. And our option there was either just go with what the authorities were saying, what we could see, and neglecting what thousands of members of our audience were telling us. And I think, in a sense, that's a model of how you can use your audience to bring a richer and fuller story, but you need to be quite clear and still have your standards.
And we saw that unrolling during the Arab Spring. A lot of different journalists used Twitter, and events were moving so quickly, but they were very careful, these journalists were very careful to denote whether the source had been checked or unchecked, and then it was interesting to see the audience help in that process. So not only were there people on the ground helping to translate, reporting events on the ground, very quickly, if something was reported in error, you would see other people come forward to say that's actually incorrect. And then, so it was up to that journalist to then report that fact. And so, again, it's about navigating your way through something that is moving incredibly quickly, using those ethics that underpin everything to inform those often very quick, very fast choices that you need to be making. But if you have those journalistic skills in place to underpin that, and you are transparent and you make it very clear to the audience what kind of information you're relaying, you can still command that trust.
Just one other question on this though. Greg, say with your papers and letters to the editor, for instance, there's a whole set of rules and protocols around checking who it is who has sent that letter, that they actually exist and their address, all the rest of it. Those same protocols don't exist with comments posted on news sites online. Are we going to get to a stage by 2050 where we'll see, one set of rules regardless of the platform?
I imagine there'll be the technologies which will enable that to be done relatively efficiently, actually. I mean, that is one element of technology. Technology allowing us to spew out information. Technology can also provide us with, and can't tell you what they are, but instantaneous recognition tokens, etc. So, I mean, there's a sort of...
So kind of the wilder commentary will be checked, do you think?
Yeah, look, I think the fundamental issue is that I don't think in a printed form people, the audience would cop, we haven't checked this, okay? But in where there's the technology provides you an instantaneous feedback loop, I think people know that what they're getting. I mean, there's a bit of user, buyer beware here going on. So basically we know, people know what's going on, and so therefore the ABC on a website, the Herald, the Age on a website can certainly make use of that sort of protocol, and I think it's very effective.
Mark, you've had a bit of curry about some of the things on the drum. I know that's commentary.
Yeah.
What kind of rule are you putting over there?
Well, I think there are two things. I mean, the drum is meant to represent a plurality of viewpoints, and so we've had more than 1,000 different writers write for the drum, and some articles have upset people from time to time. I think there have been some articles that we've probably published that in hindsight we perhaps we shouldn't have, and we've taken a few down. But there will be views up there that people don't agree with, and it will get a reaction, and that's the way it is. I think the question on the comments is a very interesting one. I think NPR in the States and others, I think, are looking more at a model that says actually to have 2,000 fevered comments may not be best value to an audience. Less may be more, a plurality of views, but possibly a more civilised discourse. And Greg's right, there are mechanisms you can already use to identify that, this one person is sending 20 comments from one computer under different names, and to try and have a more civilised but still inclusive response. And again, I think that's where different media organisations will go down different paths. And you may, if you're Fairfax or the ABC, say, no, we want to have a rational discourse here. You may, if you're another website, say, the more the merrier, the more fevered the merrier, and your boast will be that 20,000 people commented on the story.
I mean, that's the essential point. I mean, every media organisation has a view of who its audience is. So the Sydney Morning Herald or the Age audience is a peculiar audience.
Don't be offended.
Yeah. A audience within the greater totality. And so therefore choices that are made around either the conversation that those people want to have or the news choices that are presented to them are going to be very different to, say, a news limited choice worry now is that we have to be tighter and tighter and tighter in terms of determining who our audience is, what they need, and what they're interested in. I mean, in the old world, you know, and Fairfax had a monopoly on print classifieds in Sydney and Melbourne. What you could do if you were the editor of The Age or editor of the Sydney Morning Herald was make virtually any choice you want to make. This was your personal domain, because there was so much money coming into the business that it wasn't absolutely critical about what the journalism in the paper said. So you could say, well, I'm interested in that story there, or that story there, or that story there, and it was, the choices were made regardless of what the audience really required. Now, without that money coming in, and we've had to completely remake our business model, with the core being, here's the journalism, and we deliver the journalism, print, online, smartphone, iPad, IPTV, we have to know exactly who that audience is, because fundamentally we're a commercial organisation, and we have to present those audiences as attractive to advertisers. So that means the editors and the people who make these choices have to be much sharper in their knowledge of who the audience is.
But between, sorry, Kevin,
Well, does that explain then that is it your audiences who want personality politics and not issues? You know, that the media seem to be issue phobia. Is it too complex? It's got to be simple and put in an app and, you know, there
Good
it is.
point.
You know, if you ask people in here, are you sick of stories being fabricated? Are you sick of manipulation and distortion? Are you sick of opinion being presented as news, as agenda-driven news? Even vendettas that we've seen in Victoria recently from some media organisations. Phony balance, where we have to put up with 50% of the climate change debate being handed over to mad hatters, essentially. My view. You know, then when they don't even talk about it. I went to a keynote address at the 4 Degrees or More conference, an international climate change thing held at Melbourne University recently, and there were no representatives of the mass media there when Professor Sean Huber gave his keynote address. And what they missed, of course, was some of the Mad Hatters waving nooses at him and calling him a Nazi and whatever. It took 5 days before the Australian even found out that it happened and finally interviewed him, not about the climate change scenarios that he was presenting, which everybody should go online and read because they are scary, but they are based in science.
So just bring that back to you.
Yeah.
I think your key point there, Kevin, is as I say, all the distortions, manipulations, fake agendas, right?
We've got all those guarantees, you know, there are all these processes there, all the ethics, all the training and everything else. It must be the rest of the media that are the problem. Well, then perhaps the responsibility of the media here is to keep them balanced.
I don't know where to begin there. I'm not going to defend the media as a whole. Because
So just to say, pick up an example. When I moved to Melbourne around the time of when there certainly seemed to be, there was this fever around getting Simon Overland. Was that a case of media vendetta?
Oh,
Yes.
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 I think we've seen several vendettas played out just in the last year alone, and I think that is partly to do with the fact that our media is owned by 70% of our media is owned by one particular outlet, and the power that comes with that. And I think that the more the audience needs to make their views known about the fact that that's not the kind of coverage that they're looking for. The audience are a pretty savvy bunch of people, I think, and I think they can read between the lines. Personally, when reading The Australian sometimes, and for example, if we're going to talk about vendettas, the coverage of Larissa Barrent and the comment that she made during Q&A about best price and subsequent coverage that unrolled across The Australian for a good 2-3 weeks after that. I don't believe that's what the audience is looking for. I don't even believe in the news value of that. I can see that how some stories get a run and they keep going for the sheer sort of colour of it all, and people like to read those sorts of stories. But when we're talking about vendettas like that, I think it's very hard for the editor of that paper to be able to justify the news value in that kind of coverage. So I don't know whether that's answering your question,
I'm just wondering,
but I certainly don't endorse or support that kind of
Well,
journalism.
look, one person's vendetta is another person's right and wrong. I mean, one of the issues around the media is, and it's a public good. The public good is that we expose wrongdoing, we expose bad behaviour, and it is a bit like a marketplace. Markets tend to overshoot and undershoot, and so therefore, whether or not it was fair that Simon Overland was hounded out of office by the Australian, if he was hounded out of the office by the Australian or not, but the fact is that the government that he was working for made a judgment that he was no longer appropriate as Commissioner of the Police in Victoria. Now, if he had had an effective comeback to the media stories that were written about him, perhaps he wouldn't have lost his job. But I mean, the notion of that it's all, you know, fundamentally we live in a very partisan political environment. It's extremely difficult to be a high-profile person in a modern democracy. You are questioned relentlessly about what you do and your motives and the returns that you get for the work that you do. But no one makes you climb this greasy pole. That's an absolute personal choice. And if you get there, you're going to be asked questions. Some people will survive for a long time, other people won't survive for very long at all. But the fundamental role of the media is right. It is to question people who put themselves into positions of power. And sometimes they're hounded out of office and sometimes they're not. Sometimes people think it's fair, some people think it's the wrong thing to do. If you don't like the Australian, don't read it. You know, there is personal choice about the media that you consume.
Two things. I mean, the Simon Overland coverage was fascinating to watch. One thing I wouldn't say though is that kind of agenda-driven editing is new. You know, I don't think that's a new phenomenon, an internet phenomenon at all. In fact, I think you can argue that's gone on for decades and centuries. And one of the questions I think it's interesting to ask now is if, in fact, the impact of that is more diluted now. You know, when you lived in this city a decade or two ago, you had a handful of newspapers, a handful of radio stations, a handful of television stations. There were probably fewer than 10 people deciding what you could see and watch and listen to. Now, so much more content available from within Australia and around the world. And so I think the question is whether, in fact, that agenda-driven journalism is being diluted in its impact, I think is an open question. The other thing I'd say about balance, you mentioned balance. I just say on behalf of the ABC, we don't have a rule or a guideline that says there's someone with a stopwatch and a clipboard counting the number of minutes given to different sides. What we have a policy that says is that we need to ensure that over time the principal relevant viewpoints around the debate are heard. And some of those views will be views that you don't agree with. But if we shut down those views, those people will say, well, why are my views being shut down on the ABC? And so the argument is for a plurality, a range of views, a civilised debate, so that the audience can make up its mind. And I think one of the things we can say about this media environment now is that there is more voices, there is more opportunity for debate, more opportunity for our audience voices to be heard than has ever taken.
Yeah, but Mark, is there more light? That's the question.
No.
No, but, well, I think there are two
Is there still room for rational discourse? I mean, there was a lot of conversation about 20 minutes ago about civil discourse and nice, you know, what was it? Conversations and all the rest of it. Okay. But a lot of it is very, very noisy.
That's true.
Irrational.
It's a social issue, not a media issue.
But some of it will be.
Well, hang on, who's the purveyor? Come on, okay.
Well, some
Where's
of
the
it will
light?
be.
My
But one of the
question.
things I'd say that Maxine is we're not shutting other things down. You know, Four Corners is still there. 7:30 is still there. Late Line is still there. Still forums where issues can be covered in depth. there can be significant cross-examination of the major political
And
figures
people
of the
who
day.
have certain views watch those programs.
But-
Right?
But
I suppose the next question would be, are we moving into a world, and certainly I would argue the United States is very
Yeah.
close to this now, where it's more and more difficult for people in the public sphere to address, if you like, an informed, objective mainstream.
I think that's an interesting argument, and I think what you can see in Australia is, in a sense, more of an emergence of the media in recent years, where if you have a certain political point of view, you can, say, tune into a radio station or watch a television program that's there for you and your ideology in a way that a decade or two ago was far more pluralistic. I suppose where we position it, we want to make sure we're a place where all the views are heard. And I think something like Q&A, I mean some people like Q&A, others don't like Q&A, but it's been a tremendous opportunity for a range of voices, audience engagement, help set a political debate. So I think those outlets are still there, but there is more opportunity now, I think, for the audience member to opt out of that, basically, and to say, I like what Alan Jones says, and I will tune into Alan Jones and he will reinforce my views. And I will rarely hear other voices that put other views that aren't, in a sense, well, if not shouted down by Alan Jones, so seriously cross-examined by Alan Jones that it's very hard for those voices to be heard. And I think if you wanted to, then yes, you can read Andrew Bolt, you can listen to an Alan Jones, you can watch Andrew Bolt on television. And so it's the emergence here more of that, in a sense, Fox News model that says if you have a certain ideological worldview, you can have all your media experiences within it. And it's important that others are providing a more pluralistic engagement.
People hear more views. I think people get upset because there is not a balanced coverage of everything. And when you have a small choice, those media organs tended to have a relatively balanced approach because they were mass audience publications or radio stations or TV stations. But in this plethora of choice, the traditional media organs have to make a choice about who their audience is and deal with that audience. And they're no longer dealing with the mass audience that they once did. And people in their lives are hearing the sorts of views that they mightn't have heard as loudly and as consistently as they used to. And this is in fact just a consequence of technology. It's a consequence of fragmentation. It's a consequence of the communications revolution everyone's been talking about. So if you want, and it's a good thing. There's a lot of voices out there. We live in a less controlled environment than we've ever done before. But it's very frustrating for people when they don't hear their view of the world confirmed by everyone all the time.
It's also worth testing that notion of balance and what the audience means by balance and what we all mean by balance as well. I think that balance can be used to excuse some pretty lazy journalism at times. It's a matter of inserting the opposition's talking point and then the government talking point, and the job's done. The journalist has presented the story, instead of actually testing the assertions of both those sides and looking at the story behind it. And I think that's what we've seen in the US.
Is that what you're encouraging?
Yes, absolutely. And there's a role there for, more than ever, for the journalist to explain the story behind that and to make sense of all that noise and to stop for a moment and say, okay, well, this is the discussion going on, but let's explain what's going on behind the discussion, what's underpinning that, why they're saying what they're saying, and then let's test them on that. I think you've seen candidates like Sarah Palin in the US. A lot of people talked about the fact that she provided such colour and such great fodder for news outlets that she was not called to account enough on her statements were not tested enough. The kind of things she got away with saying just because they made for a great colourful news story without actually being called to account for what she was asserting.
She was a left field choice. She came from nowhere. An extraordinary kind of a moment when she intruded on that campaign. But do we really think that by election day people didn't really know that Sarah Palin thought she could see Russia from her back porch in Alaska, that she had no real understanding of foreign policy, and that the system worked.
I don't know, I think in some ways she, we'll have to see whether she decides to run again and see whether she's a valid political candidate.
I'm all for scrutiny of the media, and I think we should ask tough questions, and I think the challenge about whether we provide enough background, analysis, explanation, all valid, but Maxine, I don't think we should let the politicians off the hook as well. You know, I think if Paul Keating was here today, there'd be more people in the audience. But it would be a good question to ask Paul Keating whether he thought that the 24-hour news cycle and behaviour of the media today would have made the sweeping political and economic reforms of the 80s and 90s impossible. Could have you made the Reserve Bank independent, floated the dollar, fundamentally brought about the economic reform that he brought about, or is it also trivial and superficial and short term because of what the media is doing that those kind of reforms are possible? I'm sure he would say it would absolutely be possible.
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting that point about those economic reforms of the 80s, because fundamentally the open economy that we have now is the result of those economic reforms, and it was very different, and this question's been raised. The reason they got through is that we worked in a very controlled environment, and we delivered big reforms, but there was a level of control around information that allowed that to occur. And there was a fundamental deal between the politicians and the media and the bureaucracy. And the deal fundamentally was the politicians would provide plenty of information for the journalists. The journalists wouldn't really tackle private issues around the politicians' lives at all. That was off limits. So what you would basically write around or report around policy. The bureaucracy were allowed to provide context for stories, so you could ring up a bureaucrat, a senior bureaucrat, and they could background you and give you great substance and depth. And then it all started falling away because the politicians wanted to start controlling the message, and they didn't let the bureaucracy participate anymore in that backgrounding, so they wanted to control things. The media tended to get frustrated because they weren't getting the substance around the issues that they once got, and started eking out in looking for private stories around politicians. So we ended up with a much less functional, in fact a dysfunctional relationship between the bureaucracy, the politicians and the media around that. And that is broken down to the point now where there's massive mistrust right across the system, and your ability to deliver those big reforms, because what those reforms required was cohesion between those arms of the power structure. Fundamentally, those reforms got media support. The politicians were given a pretty free rein in which to argue for that, and the bureaucracy were there to provide context for the media. So it's just a very different world, and the fragmentation of the media, with everybody wanting their cut of the action or their bit of the story, has made it a much more difficult environment.
But it's an elegant theory, but I somehow think if Hawke and Keating were here, they would say they never signed that compact.
Well, they did. They did. I mean, you know, when I was a journalist in Canberra, I would take a senior treasury official out to lunch in public view. You cannot do that.
That's something different again. That's not some kind of secret contact that there are things we want to talk about. Well,
it was very much part of around the arrangements, the way that the system worked. But fundamentally, there were deals done about what information got out and what information didn't.
I think what is fundamentally true, though, Greg, is that in fact at some point the political class gave up on the contest of ideas, and Hawke and Keating never gave up on the contest of ideas. And I would argue there was another play that we missed out on. I mean, the genius of that period in government was that the cab drivers were talking about the stuff that the Treasury officials were talking about. That was the genius of it. You know,
because we would go on John Laws and talk economics.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, let me come back, Mark. I was going to ask you this question, and you segued into it nicely then. whether it is the United States, and I'd argue that's where we're seeing it played out most dramatically at the moment, or what's happening here, is going to be harder and harder, if you like, for the political class, even assuming they are motivated to do so, to argue out complexity. And again, I'll make another point about the technology. If you consider something like your capacity to Google, the more and more you Google on a particular area or a particular interest, something in Google does a calculation and feeds back to you over time material that plays to your own prejudices. So again, I come back, is the citizen of the future going to be less and less exposed to a wider range of views and become more and more a narrowly focused citizen, less open to, if you like, complex political discourse?
Yeah, I think that's a real risk, that more choices means more niches, and that you can select that one that simply plays it back to you. And I think we are, in the last couple of years here, we're really seeing more signs of that than we had before. And I think you're going to need a different inventory of political skills to deal with this. And I suspect that reform will take more time to happen, and that you won't be able, I think one of the legacies of the Rudd years in analysis that people look back is such a broad agenda simultaneously, which means that if different parts go off the rail, the whole thing can slow down. Whereas I suspect fewer big reforms, more purposefully delivered, recognising it takes a longer period of time to communicate those messages and get them out. I think you're going to need to play the system differently. But I don't subscribe to the view that says it will now be impossible for big, sweeping economic, political, social reforms to take place. I just think you're going to have to play the game differently. And at the moment, you get the impression that no one quite knows. There's no mastery of how that game operates in this new, complex, fragmented media environment.
But there's also something to be said to the fact that with all the white noise around every issue, the current issue being the Craig Thompson affair, minority government is functioning quite well. They're pushing legislation through. There's this sort of level of activity that's humming along quite nicely, almost as if it's behind the scenes in some ways, while all this heated debate is going on about issues that, I mean, you see it played out in question time, but as long as the government is talking to the crossbenchers on this stuff, it looks like the carbon tax will get across the line along with a lot of other pieces of legislation. Which is quite interesting to see that the fact that you don't really see that reflected back in the daily coverage from the media.
Well, that's an important point. The media doesn't make the agenda, it reports the agenda fundamentally and still does. And if there's bad behaviour in politics, it's not a media issue, it's a bad behaviour political issue. If there's ruptions, social ruptions going on in the community, a lack of cohesion going on in the community, it's not a media issue, it's a social issue. Journalists don't sit down, be it in front of a computer or be it in front of a TV camera or whatever, and make it up. They don't make it up. You know, they'll make some judgments, they'll analyse, but they don't make it up. And so therefore, a lot of commentary around the media is very much shoot the messenger and not look back, the community at times has to look in the mirror.
Are you saying there are no editors who don't sit down in the morning saying, that's the headline, you go out and get me the story that fits that headline. Make 50 calls till you get the quote I want.
Not
and if 49 don't give you the quote, I want the 50th that does. Are you telling me that doesn't happen?
Look, I mean, basically that happens, and that's the way you run the media business. You will have a very narrow and very misinformed and probably fairly tightly ideological group of people, but you cannot, you cannot fund it, and it doesn't happen. I'm telling you, it doesn't happen. You don't write on a blank sheet of paper that this is what the agenda is going to be today. You tend to reflect it, and you may argue around the judgments that are made by the media around issues, but they're not making it. We make it as a community. Our politicians make it as politicians. That's what the media is reflected in. If you're dissatisfied with the media, you're fundamentally saying you're dissatisfied with yourself.
It kind of brings me back to
Quote of the day.
where we started. I'd like my journalists to be good judges, to be judicious. I'd like them to be able to judge what is accurate and what isn't. My biggest gripe over the last 50 years is I've hardly ever been involved with a story that was covered by the media where they got the facts right. I was saying to Mark earlier that Murray McLaughlin up in the NT is one of the exceptions, as was Paul Lockyer. Good old-fashioned journalists who check their facts and...
Only two?
Two I can think of actually.
That's pretty good.
So I haven't followed your work closely.
Now, we're close to time. Final question.
If they could just be able to tell the difference between facts and opinion, and appearance and reality, like Jay Rosen was talking about last night, that'd be just a really good start. And then all that other stuff we can get into. But the fundamentals are still need a lot of work.
Well, just final comments from our panel, if you would. We're close to time. We've only covered really one question, but I think we have sort of talked about a lot of the landscape. Mark, if you had to paint a quick picture of like the media world between now and 2050, give me a 30-second elevator pitch.
Well, you're going to have more voices and more choices, and tremendous opportunities for audiences, I think. I think that great collaborative effort will get us closer to the truth. Will hold governments more accountable, will make institutions more transparent, and in a way that will be a very good thing for our society. But there are challenges in this point of transition, and I'd finish where I start. This is a remarkable transformation. This is the greatest transformation since the inventing of the printing press. We're living it out live in our lifetimes and in our careers. And we're still working out and thinking what it means. And I think a proactive and active engagement in debate around the role of the media, the role of our institutions, and how it's all working out remains vital at this time of revolution.
Sophie? I know Joe Rosen, of course, who's here with us this afternoon, has made the point, it's only baby boomers who get anxious about this. The young are fine with it, they're going to work it out. Do you think that's right?
Absolutely. I think it's an incredibly exciting time. I think as media leaders, we are still agonising over how this kind of journalism is funded, and that's part of this very painful transition. I think that is a big question, and to look to 2050 is very difficult to do in that context. I think it'll be a combination of philanthropy, public funding. I think it's a question for governments. I think it's also a question for the audience and the young audience about what they're prepared to pay for. I think that's something that they haven't thought about enough. So that's interesting. But in terms of the potential, it is absolutely limitless, and it is incredibly exciting. And we will see people will be able to sit in their lounge room and get news on a hyperlocal level and a global level. They can check what's going on down the street, and they can check what's going on in a street in Egypt, and they can do that now. So think what they'll be able to do in 2050. It's incredibly exciting.
Well, the interesting thing about what the media does, politicians are there to resolve conflict in our community, and the media is there to provide transparency. And overall, and some parts of the media do it well at times, others don't do it so well at times. But overall, in the mix of things, we have an open, democratic society fundamentally because the media, over time, does its job pretty well. It embraces change, sometimes too slowly. It doesn't get it all right, but it does fundamentally a good job. And my previous point is that as a community, sometimes our communities are not functioning the way they should be, and it's frustrating for people to live in that environment. But that is not a media issue, it is fundamentally an issue about the way our communities are working. And it's an interrelationship, and you will be more satisfied with the media that you're getting and the way we analyse it as we fix our own problems. So I think it is a relationship, I think, that has been of great benefit, and we live in a terrific society, and I think fundamentally
Greg, Sophie, Mark and Kevin. And to you, I hope you found that illuminating for the past hour. Thank you very much for your attendance.